The red zones are the territories the Russians occupied at the end of the last war. The pinks are what they roughly currently hold. In addition, the territory that they've captured in this war and have held, and then the yellow is territory that they had but lost. Right now, the Ukrainians are doing two big pushes. The one going south from Zaporizhia, the goal is to get to the Sea of Azov so that they can then target the Kerch Strait Bridge directly. Now, if you guys remember last year, someone blew up part of the Kerch Bridge. It used to have 4 road lanes and 1 rail lane. 2 of the road lanes were destroyed, and the rail line was so damaged it can't take cargo any longer. So what the Ukrainians want to do is, if they can, that southern push, if they can get to the Sea of Azov, they achieve 2 things. Number one, that last road connection on the Kerch Bridge can be targeted directly, and that's the end of all supply there. And number 2, if they can reach Azov, then land supply north of the Sea of Azov stops, and the entire southwestern front of Ukraine and all of Crimea go from being a launching point to attack Ukraine to an area that has no troop support, no fuel, no food, no ammo, no nothing. And you trigger, hopefully, a collapse in the Russian political system, because it will become obvious to everyone that the Russians can't even support their own forces. And that is where the bulk of Russian forces are. They're having a hard time punching south. This is the area that the Russians have really concentrated their efforts when it comes to defensive emplacements. So you've got a line of mines, and then a line of things like dragon teeth that are anti-tank enforcements, and then a network of trenches. And so far, the Ukrainians have proven unable to get past the mines, much less getting through the real defenses. So I don't want to use the word stalled. There's too many pieces in motion, but it's not going great. The eastern punch into places like Bakhmut, that's actually going a lot better, because the Russians never bothered fortifying the territories that they've held since 2014. And so, especially when it comes to the more recent gains in this war, places like Bakhmut, the Ukrainians are actually having significant effects. Not enough to achieve the sort of breakthrough that is necessary to break the Russian front, but there is more promising activity there. But I've got to have a little bit of caution here. Any battle in which the Ukrainians kill 3 times as many Russians as they lose of their own troops is a battle that the Ukrainians have lost. They're outnumbered massively in this war and between the countries. And the only way that they can win it is by achieving breakthrough, winning a war of movement, and inflicting at least 8-to-1 casualty ratios on the Russians. And that's what we saw last year in places like Kherson and Kharkiv. We have not seen anything like that in the offensive to this point. It's not quite an attritional fight. They're still killing a lot more Russians than they're losing, but just not enough. And unless they can break through and force a rout, it's difficult to see the counteroffensive in its current form really changing the overall strategic picture unless something new comes into the equation. That might be things like longer range missiles, but from the point that the United States and NATO give those to the Ukrainians, it's a couple of months before they can actually impact the battlefield. So we're already talking best case scenario like September, and the end of fighting season is October, because that's when it starts to get muddy again. Doesn't mean things can't change. War is all about unpredictable outcomes, but at the moment, I don't see a lot of movement. The biggest hope that Ukrainians have right now is that the Wagner effect has removed the best troops the Russians have from the field and introduced a several-day interruption in equipment flows. And the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that on the Eastern Front. But if we were going to see a big breakthrough, I think if we don't see it in the next week, we're probably not going to. Something that we know is that the Swedes know who did this, but they have not said so out loud. Now, I've always thought, because it's the Swedes, that the reason they did this is because if you accuse the Russians publicly with proof of doing the attack, then everyone in Europe has to admit that the Russians have deliberately destroyed European energy infrastructure, and that means you have to cut off all ties overnight. And the Swedes want to make sure Europe has enough time to disengage itself from Russia so it doesn't cause a permanent depression. But let's say the Swedes know that it was the Ukrainians. Well, the Swedes have already told all their allies what they know. It's known at the top, and we haven't had to change a policy out of Europe. So if it was the Ukrainians, there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable conversations to be had publicly, but all of those conversations have already been had privately, and it didn't change the math of the war. In the aftermath of things like Izium and Bucha, we had a crystallization in Europe. Most European leaders have visited the killing fields of Bucha personally, including the Germans. And so the idea that economics can trump the war at this point, I think we've moved past that. Me personally, I still have no idea. It doesn't make sense for the Russians to have blown up their own pipeline, because that was their single largest energy link and their single largest leverage against the Germans early in the war. And it doesn't make sense for the Americans to have done it. Not that we lack the capability, and the Germans and the Russians had that too. But if you go back to September 1st of last year, that's when the Russians turned Nord Stream off. And they publicly told the Germans that you now have to choose. You can either have the energy from us and still be modern, but the cost of that is you have to stab Ukraine in the back. Or we just leave it off and you deindustrialize, which is something we're seeing right now. And people forget that the Germans chose to side with Ukraine. They chose to risk deindustrialization and the destruction of their social and economic model in order to remain Western. I don't think they get enough credit for that. And so from the American point of view, we were getting ready a really big hammer because we thought the Germans were going to go the other direction. When they didn't, we're like, oh, we'll just put that down. And then 2 weeks later, the pipeline was blown up. So from an American point of view, we got everything that we wanted without having to do anything. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to then blow it up. My personal theory, I think, and it holds up a little bit better, but it's just a theory, is that Russia's Gazprom did it. Now, Gazprom is Russia's natural gas monopoly. The decision to shut off Nord Stream was made by the Kremlin. It was a political decision. And the way the contracts read for supply to the Germans is if the Russians shut off Nord Stream for any appreciable amount of time, they have to supply compensation to the Germans for the natural gas that was not shipped. And they have to do it at spot market prices, which in the aftermath of September 1 shutoff were 7 times what they were before. And so Gazprom was looking down the barrel of a 6-week period that would take every single cent of their profits for an entire year. So my guess is they blew up their own pipeline in order to trigger force majeure, but that's just a theory. Russia celebrates national privation. So this isn't Argentina. This isn't even Turkey. This is a country that prides itself on its ability to suffer. So you have to do a lot of punishment in Russia before you hit a breaking point. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. Also, I was wrong. We haven't seen disruptions out of the pipeline system so far. No one has blown up deliberately the pipelines that cross Ukraine. Oh, by the way, that's one reason why I don't think it was the Ukrainians that did it, because they have access to oil and natural gas pipelines that cross their country that are still operational that they haven't blown up. And we haven't had a problem with insurance yet. There hasn't been a single attack by any sovereign state on any Russian tanker, even though they're flowing by Ukraine and flowing by all the NATO countries on their way to India and China. And Indian and Chinese insurance has stepped into the gap to ensure coverage for the shipments. We haven't had a single incident where any of that has been called into question yet, which honestly is really, really weird, because we normally have several incidents a year across the world where shipping insurance has to pay out. So all these replacement insurance systems haven't had to yet, which is just really strange. So I stand by the forecast that this stuff is still incredibly fragile, but I'm very surprised and have been wrong that it hasn't happened yet. But let me layer one more concern into that. Russia is still getting income from its energy exports, but you have to think about where the stuff is. This is a picture of central Siberia. It's permafrost. Now, in the south, I realize that this is a completely alien concept, so just bear with me a little bit. Permafrost is in a territory where it's so cold that the subsoil never thaws at all. So you go down somewhere between 5 and 30 feet, and you hit a frozen layer, and ice doesn't drain. So in the summer, when things heat up, the top layer melts, and you get these horizon-spanning bogs. If you want to produce materials in this environment, what you do is you wait for the land to freeze, and you bring out a large army of dump trucks filled with gravel, sand, and aggregate, and you build berm roads out to a production site, which are those roads that you see going off to the right. You then build a drill pad and drill in the frozen ground through the permafrost down to whatever the deposit is that you're after. This is the highest production cost and the highest maintenance cost for any energy production in the world. It's higher than it is for most deep water. Here's the problem. Permafrost isn't just difficult to develop and maintain. The landscape also shifts. So if you get a break, a fissure, where the land can drain in those summer months, you get a slip like this. Or you can get a situation where it drains down instead of laterally and you get a sinkhole. And I put some people up there at the top so you can see the scale. Or you get a situation where you get a hotter melt one year and some of the permafrost actually does melt, not all the way down, but some of it. And in that scenario, you get trapped, rotted swamp vegetation that is very methane rich, and the methane gets released and you get a bubble that disrupts the landscape. Now, these things happen in Russia all the time, and they disrupt the berm roads and the pipelines. Here's the problem. The Russian educational system collapsed back in 1986. So the youngest suite of people who have the full suite of technical skills to do things like pipeline maintenance, they turned 60 this year. Most of the new oil and natural gas that has come out of Russia in the last 15 to 20 years the work hasn't been done by Russians. It's done by Westerners, and they're not doing it anymore. So even if the Ukrainians don't blow up infrastructure, even if there's no shipping or insurance issue, the maintenance question is going to kill pretty much all Russian permafrost production anyway. That's 2/3 of the total. It's just a question if it happens tomorrow or 10 years from now. And I don't have a prediction for that because that's weather. That's not just geology, that's surface geology. But we know it's going to happen sooner or later, and we know the Russians lack the capacity to maintain this system without extensive outside help. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow.